Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Strategy Skills podcast from Firms Consulting. If you would like to know when we produce and release new podcasts and when our insights are released, go to firmsconsulting.com/promo and put in your email address, and you'll be put onto our newsletter for any new updates. Today, I'm going to be speaking to someone very interesting with a very wide-ranging view on the major trends and issues that are going to be shaping the world for the next 10, 20 years. And what should be on the minds of executives in any country in the world. Blair Sheppard was the global leader of strategy and leadership at PwC, and he was also the Duke University School of Business Dean across several of their programs over several years. Now, having spoken to Blair, I must say it was one of the best conversations I've had on the wide variety of issues we covered, and also the seamless way we were able to segue between topics. Obviously, with my background as a senior partner, I have a very wide network of colleagues, either at a variety of firms or they used to be partners at major firms. And I can say that the conversation I had with Blair was one of the best conversations I've ever had. And it's not just because we have a particular liking for British pubs and British food, but also the fact that he has a very good balance of being both a practitioner, an advisor, and someone who's basing his insights on having seen changes firsthand, as opposed to someone who's maybe just advised or someone who has a consulting knowledge of things. So I would recommend this as one of the podcasts all listeners should pay some attention to, because I think we do cover some of the critical items that CEOs need to be thinking about. Beyond that, Blair's a very interesting person with a very good viewpoint on critical issues. So with that background, let's get straight into it. Hi, Blair. Can you hear me?
How are you?
I'm excellent. The line's a bit faint from your side. Is that because you may be using a headset, maybe?
No, I'm using my iPad because my computer was not letting me get on Skype.
That's okay. iPad will work just as well. How are you doing today?
Good. Can you hear okay?
I can hear fine. Yeah, it's a lot better. It's very clear. There's no echo or anything like that.
Perfect.
Okay, good. So thank you firstly for joining the podcast. We appreciate having you, and we're looking forward to it.
Happy to do so. So Mbariki is Toronto Skype ID.
That is
right?
correct, yes.
Are you in Toronto?
No, but I'm actually in LA at the moment, but I've never really updated my Skype profile. I used to live in Toronto.
Well, I grew up in Hamilton. That's the reason I asked.
Yes, I read it in the book. There's a big tribute to Dofasco. I was very impressed.
Well, a tribute to it historically, accurately.
Yes.
So actually, I had a call with the utility company in Ontario. They broke up Ontario Hydro and then created a bunch of these. And the vice chairman of their board is the now president of Dofasco.
Okay.
He wasn't very...
So do you have a lot of connections to Canada now, or do you spend most of your time in the U.S.?
I still have all my family is in Canada on my side, right? On my wife's side, they're all from the U.S., but my parents are dead. So I probably get back there maybe once a year.
Okay.
And I have a sort of soft spot. So I'm doing some work for the Canadian government based on the book, for example. And speaking to women leaders in Canada based on the book. And so whenever there's an invitation to do something in Canada, I say yes, because I have a soft spot for it.
One thing I really miss about Canada, Toronto in particular, is that there's a very good selection of British pubs.
Oh, yeah.
And there's not many at all in the United States.
Oh, yeah. There's none here. Well, it's particularly in LA, right? I mean, you could find some Irish pubs in Boston or Chicago.
Very few and far between. LA, I cannot find much at all. So it's a very slim pickings, because of the heritage and the history between Canada and the UK. There's a lot of good British food and British cider and British beer, and the bars are authentic. But you come to the United States and it's like, it's completely different. It's a bit of a shock to the system.
So I do have to confess that good British food sounds like an oxymoron, sort of like unique. but I do agree the British pub experience is something that is really hard to get in the U.S. And I actually, that's one of the things I miss about traveling is I loved that. Half my team is in London. Yeah. And so I'm there more than anywhere else, probably outside actually I'm never in the U.S., but And I insist that we go to the same pub that I actually lived in for 6 months, right beside, in the same sort of cheap Italian restaurant.
It's always nice to speak to a senior partner who has a favorite pub. You don't really have that conversations often with senior partners. They usually have a favorite restaurant, maybe, but not his favorite pub.
And actually really cheap Italian food. I mean, the team sort of looks at me and says, God, do you eat this crap? But so the reason for the pub is just before I became dean, I started to do corporate education. Right?
Yeah.
And we did a deal with the London School of Economics. Part of the way we globalized was, and the reason we carved out of the school was to create a for-profit thing. And in doing that deal with LSE, I felt we had to get it off the ground. So actually, we bought an apartment just a few blocks north of it. I forget the name of the main street that's north of LSE. And in a girls' school, it was sort of a little house right beside girls' school, and there was a really cool pub around the corner, and we would just go there all the time. And I miss it. It was got to know the locals, and it was a great way to get away from kind of the intellectual atmosphere and just hang out with real people.
But it also sounds like your style of leadership is not just to jet in and jet out for a meeting; it's to get to know the local culture and make decisions that way.
I don't think you can do my job in particular, or the chairman's job, either one of it, and not know the world. So and so one of the things I do, it's also in the book. I actually go to coffee shops and bring a native with me, and they'll interpret, and then I'll just have a conversation in a coffee shop or somewhere local. And then I always taxi drivers hate me because I don't let them go, and because I just think if you're not seeing the place, you're not learning. That's one of the hard parts about this, right? Is that a lot of so I was really lousy academic. I was okay as an academic, but the problem for me as an academic is I always need to touch it, feel it, smell it. Right?
Yes.
And so the notion that I could just look at data and infer truth just never struck me. And so that's part of why I thought it was important to set up the campus in China. That I don't think Americans can understand the Chinese context unless they're in China.
Yeah, I mean, it's there's a difference between teaching the Chinese the way Americans think versus teaching how to do business in China for what works in China.
Or actually teaching Americans how Chinese think, but actually teaching them in China, not in the United States, right? Because speculating about Beijing and Shanghai and Shenzhen from Washington and New York and Durham is a pretty bad way to understand China.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I found very striking is whenever I read op-ed pieces in the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times, and the person always tries to justify the experience in China, it's always very funny to me when someone says they visited China 12 times as opposed to living in China for 10 years.
Exactly. I mean, I think you can visit China 12 times and learn a lot about the place, but you better really get into it.
You have to live there.
Live it, yeah. And they don't. And so it was just funny. So when we were doing the campus, the number of things people would say about both China and the city of Henan, which is where we located, they were just ridiculous. But everyone believed them because it would decline. And so it's anyway, long story short, I do worry about that we are getting further and further away from knowing the world because we're less connected to it generally. And I think this has made it even worse. I think the electronic communication has done a lot of good things, but one of the bad things is we no longer see people. We do see them in their home, but we don't see them in their context.
So is part of your role now, your very senior role at PwC, is it about getting the firm to be more connected? Is it about making sure that you're not just serving China, but you have an actual PwC China that's also exporting its thinking?
So kind of, right? I mean, there are two formal roles, right?
Yeah.
The one is building a strategy for the network. And the problem for PwC is that we're federated, right? So we are kind of or Switzerland, right? And so the challenge in a federated structure is because the partners elect a leader for their territory, and all their profit is taken within territory, and their legal identity is a territory. They have the risk of becoming very parochial. And so part of our job in terms of global strategy is to actually get every territory in the world to understand the world on its terms than from their lens. And so, yeah, it's a part of it. And then the other one was make sure we had the leaders who can run the place. And in that case, it's absolutely true that we can't have a parochial American running a global network or a parochial Chinese. And so the issue is to get each of them to both be clear about who they are to everyone else, but also understand everyone else on their terms. And it's fun, by the way, because we're in 156 countries, I think.
Wow, that's pretty massive.
Yeah.
That's an incredible network. It's a strength, it's a disadvantage at times, but you can serve clients across all jurisdictions.
In today's world, it is a phenomenal asset because as the world fractures, being local and then figuring out how to connect globally is a huge asset.
So when I speak to senior partners from Ernst & Young and Deloitte and so on, they tell me that, as you say, it's a huge advantage, and it's starting to be more of an advantage now as the world appreciates globalization, which it didn't do as much in the 1980s. But at the same time, the challenge they face is how do you get a practice in, I'm just using this as an example, I'm not saying anything's wrong with it, Vietnam, for example, which is funding itself from its own P&L. And how do you get that practice up to speed to invest in the right skills, to standardize processes and so on? I'm sure you're seeing the same challenges with PwC.
Really, I mean, I think, yes, the challenge in part you have is that because the profit sits within territory, right? And territories are merging a little bit.
Yes.
So Vietnam for us is connected to Malaysia. But even there's a scale issue to your point, right? Which is if we need to make a major investment to change the direction of the firm, how can you possibly ask a territory of that scale to fund the nature of the investment, right?
Yes.
And so because the rate of change of client need is increasing, you have to upskill on a much, much faster basis, right? And so that forces us to do things like, say, a few things, which is let's invest in one of the large territories, have them create the capability, and then just shift it to the rest to build it. Or let's create centers of excellence. Or let's decide that for a territory that is of scale, they do everything, and for other territories, they're selective about the things they choose. The problem with that, think about the ideas in the book, right? It turns out those apply everywhere. And so you can't really say to Vietnam, we just want you to do this piece and not do the stuff that's actually just as relevant to your clients as the clients in the UK or Germany or the US, right, or China. And so it's a challenge, and your brand is only as good as your weakest component.
Yes, that's a good point.
You have to ensure that everyone has exactly the same quality and the same selectivity and the same capability for the things they choose to do. And so it's an interesting, if the rate of change wasn't so high, it would be less of a challenge. Back to the point, think about what's happening in global supply chains. Being present in Vietnam really matters. Right? And being present in Japan really matters, or Malaysia really matters, or Canada really matters. And so a mid-sized market, again, it's pretty big, but it's mid-sized relative to the U.S. A decent-sized market that can do everything, but it stretches to do everything. That it's a stress on that system. But it's if you don't have the relevant expertise, you don't deserve to be a professional services firm. So it's a problem we have to solve. So
when I was speaking to you, come across as a very positive guy, and then I read your book 10 Years to Midnight, which almost made me an alcoholic. And I mean, was that intended? You seem positive, but your book is quite different.
Yeah. So I think I am one of the world's greatest optimists. I mean, if you talk to the team, they would tell you I'm an optimist. You don't decide to persuade Duke to open a campus in China without being crazy, true. Right? You don't start a global exec ed business without being wackedly optimistic. And so. And that's the thing about the book for me that was, in a sense, hard. We begrudgingly came to the title.
So this was not a book written because you already had this thesis. This was a lot of research was done, and you decided that, well, we have no choice, but this is where the world is going.
Yeah, I mean, so think about two things. What's the likelihood that a firm like PwC would ever use the word crisis?
Yeah, that's true.
And if you knew me, crisis does not trip off the tongue, right?
Yeah.
But the problem is, the pattern is just so compellingly consistent across the three issues. The fourth one is derivative. The leadership crisis is
Yeah.
derivative, right? But on the other three, it's just the same pattern. So you have, and when the more you get into it, the more your point about it makes you want to go drink before you go to bed.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's a problem now. It's worse next year. It's worse the year after that. And if we don't deal with it a decade from now, it just blows up, right? And two of them are existential. Right? I mean, probably all three are, right? So if you think
Yeah.
about, losing trust in institutions is like fish not trusting water.
Hmm.
And the climate crisis, I think the technology crisis is potentially existential at the
Hmm.
point in which technology gets smarter than humans. But the climate crisis is existential right now, right?
Hmm.
And so you just think about it for a minute. It's how we farm, right? It's how we move,
Hmm.
how we build things. It's how we manufacture things. It's where we get energy from. And then it's all the unintended things we do that are destroying the world sinks. And if you say, well, what part of what you do on a daily basis does that affect? The answer is everything. So how easy is it going to be for us to change? And we have 10 years. That's the scary part for me. And you just do all three of them, and they have exactly the same pattern.
Hmm.
But it turns out the data speaks, right? So when it speaks, you say, "Holy cow, what have I done to my grandchildren?"
Yeah, it is a bit scary. So in reading it, I mean, I was taken by the examples. I like the way the book was written, a lot of rich data, great way for the reader to visualize what is happening, which is rare in the way people write books these days. So kudos to your team
Thank
for
you.
doing that. I like the stories, but I came across feeling this was a Western perspective. I mean, would people in other parts of the world feel they are worse off now than 20, 30 years ago?
So I think we have to be, to your point, we have to be fair about how they apply, right?
Yes.
But let's use China as an example,
Hmm.
which is a country that's been massively successful recently, right?
Yes.
Their trust in institutions is the highest in the world,
I was amazed to see that.
but it's declining.
Yeah.
And if you say, why is it declining? It's declining for the same reason it's declining everywhere else in the world.
Hmm.
So, the original book on disparity, he rewrote it, right? And in that book, he's included China and shows that actually China's disparity is accelerating as fast as anyone in the world.
Yeah.
And if you sort of say, okay, let's take a look at retirees, people who have a job, and people who are entering the workforce, the crisis of prosperity. So there's a book called The Ants.
Hmm.
Essentially, it describes a massive number of students graduating from second and third tier universities
Hmm.
who don't have the qualifications to get a job and are living in student graduate slums.
Hmm.
And like 10, 12 to 13 people in a building, right, in a room, in an apartment. And so if you say, okay, there's kids graduating who don't have the right degree because the system is not keeping up with the requirements for that's a big issue in China. They're graduating to a job market that's really good for 10 or 20% of them, but terrible for the rest of them. The country is accruing national debt like other countries are, so you're going to have a tax like everyone else. And then, the issue is one of the ways you accrue wealth is you actually buy a home.
Hmm.
The median cost of a house of an apartment in the 5 largest cities in China is 40 times median income.
Hmm.
So they'll never buy. I mean, now it turns out the top 10% will do fine, but actually
Yes.
masses will never acquire wealth. And their parents acquired it by actually giving up property, and they were given a couple of apartments to give up property, right?
Yeah.
So on the entry graduate has the same challenges everywhere in the world. You go to retirement, there really isn't a retirement capability built into the Chinese system. The retirement safety net doesn't exist. And they're aging at an accelerated rate because of the one-child policy, right?
Yeah.
And so they're going to get older than the U.S. Within a year or two, and they'll catch up with most of Europe, not Southern Europe, within a decade. And so they're going to have people retiring broke, just like you have in problem in the rest of the world. And then, so Kunshan is the town where Duke located, right?
Yes.
It is the town where a lot of the thing we're talking about, where iPads are manufactured. The way it used to be manufactured is they would find women who were small from central China to put things together because you need small fingers to assemble, right? So you had to be delicate. Yeah. And so they brought people who were living in relatively impoverished circumstances into Kunshan, put them in the factories. And now they've automated the factories, and they didn't retool those people. So they've gone back to their villages, having learned what it's like to have a better life, but now it's not clear what they're going to do next. And so you have people losing work left behind in China the same way you do everywhere else. And so the prosperity problem, although you wouldn't think about it, is just as applicable to China.
Yes.
And the climate problem is bigger, right? It turns out if you take Asia, of the 10 countries most affected by climate, 7 or 8 of them are Asian.
I remember reading a report, it may have been the IMF, which said China's total factor productivity has been actually declining since 2010, after seeing quite significant growth over the last 30 years. So coming back to these numbers and these scenarios and actual data you've presented, if we look at the world, say 100 years ago, maybe 120 years ago, when we moved people in the United States from farms into urban areas, the refrigerator came in, televisions came in, automobiles came in. That was quite a big shock to the system that we adjusted to. Do you not feel that there's a way out for us to adjust to this?
So this is essentially, Carl Fry's argument, right? That we're going through something very similar to the Industrial Revolution. And if you look at it, you got robber barons the same way we have massive wealth creation. And so in some ways, there's a historical parallel. A couple of pieces to that, right? In the instances where we've gone through massive transformation like that, there were huge costs and some pretty awful things happened after that.
Yes. World wars and so on, yes.
Yeah, I don't want that to occur, right? So you could say, Blair, we've seen it before, we get over it. Yeah, but do you want to send your kids off to war, right? And it's going to be a much uglier war if we had a war. And so do you really want a revolution? Or do you want to fix the system as it exists and make it more robust, right? So that's one piece, which is even if you accept that the historical exemplar is close. Second point, I think, is that we are taking work away that is very human. So sort of say, what could we escape to historically when we lost work? You could escape to creativity, imagination, the thing that sort of makes people.
Yes.
Well, actually, as you start to introduce AI and robotics, you begin to lose your competitive advantage there, right? And so what's left, right? And there is obviously things left, but for a lot of people, it'll be left behind. And then I think the other piece in that is that it's really big for people that it's hard to know what they can do about it without us actually collectively acting on it, right? Yes. So that's the prosperity question. Similar, I think, and it's happening faster, right? So the Industrial Revolution took a long time to happen. This one's happening faster. So trauma is going to be deeper, harder, nastier. And I think the other problem is what's on the back end is an interesting question. Again, I'm an optimist, so I think it's good. The transition is going to be a bear. So I think the crisis of prosperity is less existential than the crisis of technology and the crisis of institutional failure. I think those two are really existential, and there hasn't been a precedent for them. It's the only time really that we created the capacity to destroy the human race was the nuclear bomb. But the difference in it was a single technology that you could contain. This is actually everything we do, right? And so it's a much harder containment change problem. And institutional failure, if institutions can't keep up at the pace they need to, the problem there is, and it's true that we'll work through it, but whenever institutions failed, we had really ugly outcomes.
Yes, that's true. Well, look at the the predecessor to the United Nations.
Yeah.
So let's look at some of the tensions here, right? Because you raise a good point. I mean, the point I think most people forget is that, yes, we've overcome problems before, but at great cost and sacrifice. And what you're saying, which I think is a very critical point, is how do we navigate the current challenges without incurring the same pain and sacrifice as we've incurred before? What can we learn from that? So here's a tension that I think you're seeing with clients and so on, and maybe you can talk to this. On the one hand, we have an investment community, and we have individuals who will buy shares into a company like Netflix, which is completely asset light. It can roll out its platform across the world in 7 years. That's unprecedented. But at the same time, it creates almost no employment in those countries.
Yeah.
Not no employment, I said almost no employment. So you've got a
Yeah.
situation where a company is severely punished if it incurs the costs of investing in communities. But at the same time, if you don't invest in those communities, you're getting to a situation that you've just pointed out. So how do you manage that? How do you manage that tension whereby you're being rewarded for something that's inherently unstable, but at the same time, if you don't do it, you get beaten by someone else who's going to play the same game?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting problem because it's the characteristic of platforms, right?
Yes.
The challenge of a platform is that by definition, it concentrates wealth, and by definition, it utilizes far less people. And so, unlike GM, right, which was when it was massively successful and dominated the world, it had all this derivative employment, all these suppliers, right? And
Yeah.
so they'd have maybe 100,000 of their own employers, but they'd have 1 million others, right? And so I think that's a core challenge. And what we have to do is make the creation of thriving local communities and humanizing technology as design constraints on platforms.
Yeah.
So essentially say, look, you can be everywhere, but you can't be everywhere and destroy the place, right? You actually have to be everywhere and enable local economies to thrive.
Yeah.
And it's not that hard, actually. I mean, if you sort of said, is there a way in which you could take either Alibaba or Amazon, or you could take any of the platforms and say, could you use your platform to make sure that every community you operate in has a thriving economy? Of course it could, right? And because they're everywhere, they can actually then build the connectivity. And so for me, here's the analogy. So imagine we had the Olympics and there were only 2 people who could qualify because no one else could meet the standard.
Yeah.
That's essentially what's happening, right? By analogy. If you say, how do you fix that? You kind of build it a local sports team at a time, right? You'd build a gymnastics club in a bunch of towns, and they compete within county, and then they compete in province and state, and then they compete nationally, and then they compete. And I think we have to say to the platforms, your job is not just to be ubiquitous, but to be beneficial with 2 design constraints. Don't hurt people, help people, right? And anticipate the unintended consequences. So be smarter psychologists and sociologists than you are now. And second, create or help sustain thriving communities. Make them do it themselves, right? But help sustain thriving communities. And I think that's completely doable, by the way.
No, I like that idea. I think we've seen sports teams and sports organizations like the NBA do that. The International Rugby Federation does that very well. Because, it's exactly the same situation. Rugby is a sport where you only have 3 major nations. Well, Europeans will disagree and say there's maybe 6 major nations, but you've got maybe 6 major nations. And unless you find a way to seed countries like Tonga and Fiji to play at those lower levels and build a conveyor belt of talent, in the long term, nobody's going to win.
Exactly. This is, I think, in a way, FIFA did this really well, actually, right? In the sense that there's lots of things they didn't do well. But one of the things they did really well was actually get nation states to invest in local soccer clubs and create local competitions. And so, the emergence of African nations in soccer is spectacular, as an example. And so I think it's a feat, and it is a platform, right?
Yes. And it's a good example because nobody's going to watch. Well, not nobody, but more people will watch the FIFA World Cup and the Rugby World Cup if you have a real competition.
Yeah, exactly. And
so everyone wins.
I mean, the point is that we know in the Olympics and in sports and in other things like that you eat your tail if one country wins all the time. Right. If you allow the emergence of dominance, then essentially it becomes uninteresting for everybody, right? Well, it turns out it's also true for platforms. I mean, the ironic element is if we create enough regions that are economically disadvantaged and we concentrate wealth at the rate we're continuing to concentrate wealth at, eventually it eats its tail.
Yeah.
It harms itself, right? And so I think it's in everyone's interest to say, how do you use it? And you're seeing examples, right? So, some of the platforms are saying we're trying to encourage local entrepreneurship and we're putting them on the platform with a lower cost rate, right? We're trying to do. And so they're getting it, right? We just have to make it happen faster.
Yeah. So if you look at the world today, right? I mean, the example you gave is an excellent example. And I think the concept makes sense. We've seen it work. So you've looked at the US stock market. You've got 5, maybe 6 major companies, all tech, hiring very few people. So at the moment, you have the European Union, to some degree, taking on the role of saying, hey, tech companies, you've got to invest in local content, you've got to invest in local economies. But how do you corral everyone? How do you get all these big players to see the benefit of doing this? What is the coordinating mechanism to do this?
Really good question. So, because one of the elements of adapt, right, which is polarization, fracturing. So, a couple things I think. First is let's agree collectively as much as we can on the one or two or three key priorities around the world. And I think part of the reason I say that is that actually, because of the fractured world, the more we actually add priorities, the more we can actually completely fool ourselves, because one place will say we're achieving this one, another one we're achieving this one, but actually globally we're achieving none of them, right? And so let's just agree for now that climate and massive, small, inclusive business growth are two things we want to do, right? And you could pick another two. Climate is obviously one of them as far as I'm concerned, but you could pick another two. And let's just agree on it. And when you agree on it, then I don't really care how you experiment to make that happen.
Yeah.
Just focus on two things. And what we'll find is we'll start studying each other and actually we'll converge to some kind of norm, right? And so if you said we're going to focus on those two things, you'd actually say to the platforms, part of your job is to help us accelerate progress to a carbon-free economy, right? And part of your job is to create thriving local communities and create massive entrepreneurship of the order of, what the Ravi in Catalan says in India. They need 10 million small businesses in the next decade that are successful, not that are started, but are successful. That's a ridiculous number, by the way. Let's go do it. And if we focus, we can. And I think the interesting thing is what COVID taught us is when we decide there's one thing we're going to go after, we actually can achieve it.
Yes.
Right? We moved to this technology I'm talking to you over, right? And we shut the economy down and we invented a vaccine. We blew everything out, but those three things we achieved at a speed and scale that's really hard to envision actually before we did them.
But doesn't that come back to your original point whereby we want to avoid these crises where it's the only time we react?
So someone asked a really interesting question. Said, so Blair, when we solve these four, are there going to be four more right after because we're also moving so fast, right?
Yeah.
I hope not, because two of them are existential, right? So I just don't want us to face another couple of existential crises the next decade. I think that clearly every answer creates its own problems.
Yeah.
But hopefully the answer actually is one that's less threatening and less harmful, right? And then I think the other thing is that one of the things that happens, back to your historical analogy, right? One of the things that happens is rethink the social system in a way that's more adaptive to the circumstances we have. So part of the way we got out of the problems of the Industrial Revolution is we invented liberal democracy.
Yes.
Right? Well, we have to invent the new form, whatever it is. And so I actually am kind of, I'm probably one of the few people who would say this. I think the experimentation that's going on in the world in terms of what a political economy should look like is a healthy, not an unhealthy.
Your choice of words is very interesting. I've never heard anyone say we invented liberal democracy. But when you think about it, it actually makes sense. We invented this political, socioeconomic order to manage the ills of society. Yeah. And like anything you invent, you've got to put a lot of time and money and effort into keep it together.
Yeah.
We have anarchy, and we can invent something better.
Yeah, I mean, it turns out liberal democracy is a social construct, right? It's from the mind. I mean, it didn't exist before we created it.
Yeah, it's...
And so the same thing. And now I think what happens, if you think about it, is that every civilization, if it's good, is an improvement upon the previous one. So the point for me isn't that you'd say, let's throw out all the principles of liberal democracy, right? It would be, how do we make it better and more resilient to the world we now find ourselves in? We'll probably call it something other than that, right? So one of the interesting issues in the liberal democratic ideal is I think unhealthy competition among nations. Yeah. Right. So go back to sports. What's really interesting about, if you ever talk to an athlete, what they'll tell you is, while they're competing with them, they hate their competitor, but they love them when they're not, because it's what makes you better. Yeah. Right. So could we reinvent the notion of competition to make it a little more healthy in a world where you have so much interdependence? Right. Could we? And I don't mean to propose the answer, because I think it's a really important question. A lot of than you and I have to solve. But I think it's a thing we need to invent. And so if you come back and put the two thoughts together, let's pick a couple of things we take on collectively around the world, both in business, in civil society, and in government, and personally as individuals, right? And let's use it to force ourselves to confront what's required to make the sorts of answers we're coming up with sustainable in society, and invent the new social order.
That makes sense. I mean, if you look at what you're saying in your book, it seems as if the sort of major four themes you pick out, you've got to overcome two of them to have the right to reinvent liberal democracy. Because climate change is something, if you don't fix, you're not going to get the chance to fix the others, right?
You got it. Exactly.
So let's just step back, right? One thing that impressed me and saddened me a little bit. Sorry?
I think actually massive disparity. I think, the institutions is the liberal democratic question. How do we reinvent it, right? But I think the crisis of prosperity and climate, if you don't address those, you don't have the right to have a new civilization.
We're going to have a new French Revolution in our hands.
You got it. Or we'll be dead because
yes.
It will have killed us, yes.
So let's think about this, right? Because we have almost a live experiment going on here. We know that in the right circumstances, governments all over the world who don't agree on just about anything can actually do the same thing like what they did with COVID and cause a massive shutdown. Whether it's right or wrong, let some other people debate that. The fact is they can do it.
Yes, they can.
So we can act under the right circumstances. So how do we create circumstances where everyone sees it's in their interest to act against these other existential threats? I mean, it's a big question, but what do you think? What are some of the advice, tips? I mean, you're seeing it with corporate clients, corporate leaders. What do you think is the root?
I mean, I'll tell you, it's interesting. I mean, in a sense, the challenge in part is how do we get governments to get there fast enough? Because it's a hard thing to be a government right now, right? Just think about the poor leader who's trying to run a country. So you've got massive disparity in your country. You have systemic challenges that are real. The institutions are behind the times and need to catch up. You are facing an existential crisis, and your society is polarized, and they don't trust you as a leader.
Yes.
Bless you, And so I think that part of the reason that institutions that are slightly less democratic are being more successful in the short term, it's hard. You don't know who's going to be more successful in the long term, but more successful in the short term, is they have to navigate fewer of those problems. They all have to navigate a massive number of problems. So God bless a political leader. So for me, I think I would argue, let's start with the shareholder. Let's get them. And there's a convenient thing happening about shareholders, right? So think about who are the primary shareholders of companies today. It's sovereign wealth funds, it's institutions, and it's a limited number of very wealthy families. Right.
Yes.
So, and there's others, but they control the dominant share. Well, so let's start in order. Wealthy families, they're so wealthy now that they can't possibly spend it all, and therefore, what they're looking to is to say, how do I preserve this wealth for generations? That's a pretty long time horizon.
Yes.
Right. If you take institutions, the two major institutions are university and retirement funds, right? Well, it turns out pension funds. It turns out those institutions actually, it's the people who they serve that they're hurting if they don't do something about these issues. And they also have very long time horizons. Universities aren't here today and gone tomorrow. The universities want to be around for hundreds of years, and pension funds have to be very long term because they're trying to fund people into their 80s and 100s. So they have a long horizon and they care about the outcomes. And then if you take sovereign wealth funds, clearly their job is to produce wealth for the nation, but in a way that makes the nation better.
Yes.
So the three primary shareholders have a time horizon that is beyond the time horizon we describe in the book. And so if we could get people to recognize that shareholder value and moral imperative are, for all intents and purposes, the same thing right now, we would make massive progress.
So what I want to do here is I just want to paraphrase what you're saying so the listeners can follow it, because I think it's quite important. Because when you look at all the problems facing the world, it can seem overwhelming, right? I mean, this is too much of it. There's always more problems than money in the coffers of a state, federal, local government to handle. But what you're saying is that if we break down how decisions are made, how key corporate leaders are influenced, there's a small subset of actors who play an outsized role. And if we focus on them and get them to act with the goal or with the intention to fix these problems, we can start the process.
Yeah, start it. To your point, start it. We clearly have to bring civil society and political systems with us, but start it, because someone has to start. And it turns out they have the financial wherewithal and the technical wherewithal.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens if you get a shareholder, whether they're privately held companies are doing it or they're actually holding in public companies, if you can get the management of the organizations to recognize that it is actually in the shareholders' interest to do the things that are material. This is really important. So you don't say to any one company, you've got to meet 40 ESG measures.
Yes.
You say to a company, deal with the things that are material for one of two reasons. Either it will harm the value in your business if you don't address them.
Yeah.
And we've done some estimates about how much, for example, physical risk of climate hurts business. It's a lot, right? Over the next few years, or because you're the primary culprit, and society will come back and bite you if you don't do something about it, right? And then start acting. And I think if it turns out if the utilities do what they need to do, and the automotive companies do what they need to do, and the hotel companies do what they need to do, and the cement companies do what they need to do, and the professional service firms do what they need to do, where we need to change the measures, really, right, in some ways. And advisory. If you get all of that happening, we make massive progress. And what's nice about it, if you sort of say, let's solve climate in an inclusive way that generates lots of small business and deal with the platform issue at the same time, which would be really cool, right? Then actually what's nice about picking the first two I described is you can coattail everything else.
Yes.
All other UN development goals can coattail on climate and inclusive small business.
We have there is a good example of this working, but it also raises the challenge of how to replicate it. Because if you look at the automotive sector, you have one company and really one person. And of course, he's got a whole team behind him. But if you look at what Tesla has done, it's forced the entire automotive sector and the original equipment manufacturer supply chains to rethink the business case around electric vehicles.
Yes.
So it didn't take, PwC and all your peers and government sitting down with every single supplier and every single automotive company and mapping out the transition with incentives and penalties and so on. No, you had one person with one company and one vision who thought you should go in this direction and pulled everyone along. But it does raise the other point, right, which is how do you find that trigger in other sectors?
So let's take your specific example and then go to the general. How do you generalize that point, right? Okay, so it turns out that being an iconic symbol doesn't matter if the rest of the system doesn't follow you. Mm-hmm. So it is the case that eventually you have to sit down with every automotive company and help them think through what they need to do to compete in the world that he's leading in, right? And they are, by the way, they're massively recreating. I mean, the focus that GM just took, for example, is amazing. So there is this kind of iconic leader, and then the rest follow, and we need them to follow fast.
Yes.
So it is true at some point you got to marshal the resources, right? And pretty quickly. But so then if you go from industry to industry, I think your point is right. And there's an interesting thing in this, which is it's pretty likely that if you are the leader in any one of those fields, you will create massive shareholder value. And he did, right? So take a look at the utility companies that are getting to renewables way faster than anyone else. They're starting to be really valued very highly relative to all the other utility companies, right? If you look at, so you just go from, so you need one to take the lead and say, I'm going to do it. And the important point is because it's now within the time horizon of the shareholders window, it's material. And it's material, actually, if you get there first, you can create massive value, and then others have no choice but to follow.
Yes, because you've reshaped the industry.
Exactly. Take that same strategy from sector to sector, sector to sector to sector. And up until now, that hasn't been possible, but because it's 10 years to midnight, it's now possible.
Yes.
Right? And so your story is a great example of what I think we need to do.
But it's also an example of how you shouldn't get caught into media hype, because, it's easy to just say we want to be the next Tesla of our industry and so on. But I was reading an article a few weeks ago which outlined that the country of Bangladesh has now reached parity with India on GDP per capita, which is a phenomenal achievement if you consider how the press depicts Bangladesh. But what I found fascinating about that is that Bangladesh didn't have a Tesla. The way they did it is they went after the textile industry and they found ways to bring females, women, into the labor force, which is a tremendous achievement considering the kinds of situations women face around the world, particularly in developed countries. And here's an example. It's a good example that you don't need the flash, but just solid business principles and practices to solve big problems.
Yeah, this is really important, right? Which is, I think, if you leave the sector conversation for a minute and go to the regional conversation or national, local conversation, part of what you need to do is begin with what can you reasonably do given who you are?
Exactly.
So it's a real mistake to sort of go to Bangladesh and say we're going to put a chip manufacturing.
I think some people may have tried that.
Because what you're going to do is actually import the labor to do it, right? Because you can't educate the population fast enough, and all you have is an eyesore in the country, right? Now, you have some derivative benefits, but what you're better to do is say, what's the capability of the people locally, and how do we build on that incrementally so they ratchet up? And you go from textiles to clothing and you just keep increase the value over time. But you start with what they're able to do, right?
Yes.
And so you might say for something like, if you imagine sort of some of the poorer states in India, say, go invent a new agricultural model. Right? Go and find local energy solutions that allow you to invent a new agricultural model, but do a thing where the average person in that locale has the potential to participate. And so what I really like about the Bangladesh example is it was an example that was meant to be inclusive.
Yes, that's true.
It was really innovative. It was focused on competitive advantage that the country had, and it was meant to be inclusive. And if we go back to the platform point, platforms could easily facilitate that sort of conversation all over the world.
Yes. And, if you circle this back to what really matters, you were a dean of a very well-known business school.
Yes.
One of the things you see in business schools is it comes down to the inclusiveness of the case studies that are used to educate future leaders.
Yes.
If you only use case studies of Western companies, while the learnings are useful, how does someone who comes from Bangladesh to the United States and then go back, how do they take a lesson that's directly relevant to them? So, how is the business school approach that problem of inclusiveness in its case studies to be more representative?
Well, so the challenge of business schools is they are institutional like everyone else, right? And so they're not adapting fast enough is part of the answer to your question.
So they can do more, but they're on the way or they're resisting?
They're on the way. I think they're on the way. But the problem is, so if you think about one of the challenges with institutional change, and it's a really interesting paradox, which is that institutions are designed to be stable because we need them to be.
Yes.
Right. And so if you ever try to change a curriculum in a university, it takes like 7 years.
That's true.
Well, so the problem is we don't have 7 years. Right, because if you accept the premise we've got 10 years of midnight, by 7 years, it's too late to be graduating people in time to solve the problem. Right?
Yeah.
A little unkind because we are beginning to. But even there, we have way more people, if you just say with the climate example, and I'll go to your point about Bangladesh in a minute, we have way more people who can tell you what's wrong, and far few people can tell you how to solve the problem. Right? So we need to shift the capability set, right? So now go back to your point. I think that we need universities to find a way of governing themselves that retains the core attributes of governance, but allow much faster change.
Yes, that's well said.
And I think we need universities to deparochialize. So part of the problem is, how do I persuade Cambridge to worry about the Bangladesh example?
Yes.
Right. And so what they'll do is say, I'll teach you entrepreneurship in a context with a social philosophy behind it, by the way, which is all presumed. And then I expect you to take it and use it in context. And that works if you have enough time. We don't have that kind of time. So I think your point is taken on two grounds. One of them is we need to be more contextual in the things we teach. So we need to help the translation from idea to practice all over the world, right? Yes. And the second is some of our doctrine we need to completely overturn.
Yes, I wonder if we teach empathy enough.
I I don't think you can teach empathy enough, right? By definition, we probably don't. But I think we teach the head more than the heart, I guess, is a fair point to say. About 110 years ago or so, university presidents used to teach the last class in many universities, right? And the class they taught was, how do you take all this stuff you've learned and use it to be a citizen? We don't teach that class anymore.
Why is that? Why has that class been dropped?
Because we're functional specialists.
I see now. Do you feel that there is now an opportunity? Well, let me rephrase this, right? So we have these very relevant, factual problems you've identified with your colleagues, and I agree with all of them.
Thank you.
But shouldn't we rethink the way we teach our leaders so that they don't repeat these mistakes in the future?
Well, of course. You're describing, the thesis I would have is in the last chapter of the book, right? And in some of it, I think it's the biggest crisis, because if we don't get leaders to be adaptive to the world we're in, they'll keep trying to solve today's problems with yesterday's theories.
Yes, it's right. Like some countries, I don't want to name them because we probably have listeners in those countries, but you see them repeating the same bad economic decisions every 5 years.
Yeah.
And I think to myself, but where are these economic leaders being educated? Shouldn't they change the curriculum? I mean, they've repeated this mistake for 30 years. Shouldn't they know by now?
So I think that to me, I think the issue in part is there are a few kind of core things I think every leader needs to be good at. I'll come back to that in a minute. But I think and they have always been important, they're just way more important. Empathy being one of them. The ability to understand the world from someone else's shoes is really important today, right?
Yes.
But then what you have is these challenges where you have to be good on two sides of a problem that feel at odds with each other.
Yeah.
So, just think about the person who was the best at managing COVID you can think of. I'll bet you that they had the following characteristics. They were really humble enough to know they didn't know the answer to the problem. And they sought input from a very diverse set of people. And it was their humility that caused them to realize that they needed to seek even more input. What happened, though, when they finished getting the input, they realized they had to make a decision. And there was no right answer. Right? At the time this all played out, there was no right answer. But they had the courage to decide anyway, because they knew an answer that was imperfect, that they were going to get slammed for, right? The media was going to crush them, right? No matter what they did, they were going to get slammed for it. They took it anyway, right? So they're heroic. Now ask yourself, how many people in the world are heroic, humble heroes?
It's a small number.
Be both, right? And then you sort of say they're also pretty technically sophisticated. They could talk to a doc, they could talk to an epidemiologist, they could talk to a social theorist about what kind of messages will sell. They could have an expertise-based conversation and some pretty deep technological conversations. But they understood how human systems work, right? And the ones I saw were brilliant said, I know what it takes to bring my country together at this point in time, or my company, or my province, right, at this point in time. And they were really sophisticated students of people, but they could have a pretty deep technical conversation at the same time. How many people can work both sides of that deal?
That's a tough skill set to master.
And so, in the book we described 6, and I think they're all equivalently hard. And one of them comes back to the point we were talking about, this issue of what does it mean to rethink the liberal democratic ideal, right? A thing that I think is absolutely critical is that we need people who care deeply about tradition and purpose, but are massively innovative. Those don't sit together easily, right? They really don't. And so what you need is people who say, I love what's special about this thing, and therefore I have to change everything else to preserve it.
Honoring the past, but being relevant for the present.
Yeah, so the example that made this idea come to life for me, one of my close friends is the dean of the divinity school at Duke. And so he was describing to me at dinner one night, when we were able to go out to restaurants for dinner, a problem that he was having around changing the curriculum and the way they were approaching what they were doing in the divinity school. And he coined the phrase essentially that we then borrowed and adapted a little bit around. What does it mean to be a tradition innovator, right? And I said, the problem you've got is, how do you say to people God was wrong 10 years ago? That's really hard, right? And so the point is, he had to sort of preserve what's special about religion, and you can't throw that away because it's in the Bible, right? But then make it relevant to the 21st century.
That's a great example, because religion's been pretty successful. You can learn a lot from it. Very
successful, as have universities generally. I mean, they're both of them are changing too slowly because they're institutions, and so they have to increase the rate of change. But yeah, I think that, to me, that's the one that made it all come to life around really love, in a sense. And it's the same thing if you go back to what does it mean to make local first work. Love what's special about the place, even its flaws, and then innovate like crazy around it.
That's well said. One of the things I hope that comes out of all of this is we don't just solve these problems, because I'm confident we'll do it. I mean, I have great faith in humanity. But I would hope that we change the way we think, so that we don't just become a generation that thinks if we solve this problem, we've solved all of the problems that will ever face mankind. But we create a system of thinking whereby we're almost trying to forecast what's going to happen and get ahead of it.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with that. I mean, I think that, so let's go back to the simple practical problem of technology has unintended consequences.
Yes.
Right. Let's figure out what those are before we build it. Make it a design spec that we actually spend a lot of time thinking about the unintended consequences and how we mitigate those in the design process. Right.
That's true.
We don't make that a requirement. So that's a very technical representation to the point you're making, which is a much larger point. As we try to respond to the challenges we're grappling with, let's bring the future into the execution against the current problem.
Yes.
Now, what happens is that you should kill my job, by the way. Right? So I'm global leader of strategy, and what that requires is that the executor actually be highly strategic in execution, right? Which is kind of cool, actually. But it's to your point, which is. So if you think about how do we repair the damage of COVID, let's repair the damage of COVID in a way that solves the 4 crises.
Yes, and teaches the current generation to be prepared for new problems.
Yes, how to do that again and again and again and again and again and again, right?
Yeah, I think that's very important, because one of the things I see with the whole electric car debate, it's as if electric cars dominate, all the problems go away. No, I want to know what someone's going to do with all those batteries. I mean, I don't want those batteries in a landfill near me.
No question. You don't. You certainly don't want to drink the water unless you got good liners in the landfills, right?
So, every technological solution creates an unintended consequence.
Exactly.
And that's what we need to be teaching people, is to say, yeah, we gotta respect, we gotta honor, and we gotta appreciate that we're making a leap forward, but we gotta understand that it's not a panacea that's gonna fix everything, and we gotta be prepared.
And it's really exactly. And what's really kind of cool about that, actually, is there are hypothetical answers to that problem that we haven't yet solved. But if you could bring them forward faster. So it turns out graphene is probably a wonderful alternative to really dangerous metals, right?
Yeah.
What's cool about graphene is you pull it out of the atmosphere.
Wow.
Right. You pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, or whatever combination carbon is, you split off oxygen and hydrogen. You use hydrogen as a full fuel, and oxygen you split back in the atmosphere, and then you use the carbon to make graphene. Now doing that, by the way, we don't know how to build graphene of a scale that allows us to build a battery of scale, but that's a technical problem that we can solve.
Yes.
And so we probably know already the next generation answer. Now, I don't know what the answer is for an even better battery than that.
Sure.
Right. But
we always have to be looking ahead.
Yeah, exactly. At least one step.
Yeah, I mean, it's a simple analogy. Analogy I use with a lot of people is health food. A lot of, there's a big trend now on organic food with no preservatives, no active ingredients and so on that are bad for you. Yes. But a lot of these foods and CEOs position their products as healthy. But healthy is not an absolute measure. You're only healthier than something. And you can always have healthier food. It's not as if we've solved the problem of healthy food. It's a point I always make with clients, don't speak in absolutes. Don't say, well, I work at an electric car startup and we've solved the problem. Well, yes, you've solved part of the problem, but you're going to create new problems. You have to have the mindset of knowing you have to always be improving. You always have to be looking around the curve to see what's coming next, and just hope it's not a semi truck hurtling across. But I think that's the mindset that's missing, and I think we're both talking about the same thing. So it's about making sure that we're not letting this crisis go to waste, and that's what I'm most worried about.
Yeah, so I am a little less optimistic that we'll solve the crisis in time.
That's why your book is called 10 Years to Midnight.
Yeah, I would like people to have a great sense of urgency. What I don't want to do is let them off the hook, I guess.
Yeah.
Really, right? But I do agree with you that in solving these problems, we need to do three other things, actually. One of them is use them to invent a new view of what society ought to be that's more resilient, more robust, and more inclusive.
I like that.
And use them to bring the other things with them. So, if you say one of the challenges is how do we increase the quality of education for young girls in certain parts of the world? You can't solve the climate problem unless you do that. Mm-hmm. You can't solve the inclusive small business problem unless you do that. So use them to drive it, right? And then the third is your point, which is anticipate the next round.
There's always going to be a next round. The world does not stop once you solve a problem.
Exactly. And bake the potential to address the next round into your current response. So bring the future into your current execution.
I was reading an interview with the CEO of Microsoft, and he was saying that one of the things he's tried to do at Microsoft is to get the company to see transformation as a way of living as opposed to being a once-off event.
Yes, agree.
And that's what you're saying. You've got to always know that it's just completely normal to solve one thing and expect something new to come up, and just be prepared for that.
Kind of by definition, right? Because your answer is novel, and as soon as it's novel, it's going to do things you couldn't understand because you haven't experienced it before. Yeah, it's definitionally true, right? And what we know is that the nature of the technology system we're operating in is it's going to cause us to accelerate the speed at which we do things, and therefore there'll be a new problem, right? And frankly, it's a good thing, right? I mean, again, I hope the next round are not existential, right? Some of them probably will be, by the way.
Well, it doesn't matter what happens. The next round is going to be completely different because for the first time ever, we're living in a world that's not completely dominated by the West.
Yes.
If you are the CEO of a company in the West, you should be very worried what's happening in Asia.
And I think what's interesting is, we're defining this in some ways. We're using a 20th century logic, which is nation state to nation state, U.S. versus China, right?
Yeah.
Actually, it's not that. It's actually a region of the world is evolving in a way that's really healthy, actually, really healthy, but it will create competitive pressures on the other region of the world. And but the world's better off if 3.5 billion people are better off.
Absolutely. There's no dispute there. If everyone moves forward, everyone is better off.
Exactly. And so it's back to my analogy, which is if I believe that a competitor makes me better, I love my competitor.
Yeah, competition is good. Fair competition.
Yeah, a competition a fair competition, agree entirely, fair competition, which is why we need regulation, right? And competition where you choose to compete. If you roll over and die, too bad for you. But I think in a way, so we have to look at Asia evolving as an opportunity on two counts, really. One of them is it will make the whole world better. Mm-hmm. Because the whole world will have to step up and compete. Right?
Yes.
And the second piece is it will bring philosophical principles that are likely to cause us to have a better social system as a result.
Yeah, it also forces us it holds a mirror up to our own development and what we hold dear.
Of course. Yeah.
We've got to reevaluate who we are as Western institutions.
So this goes back to the personal part of the conversation you were having in the beginning, right? Which is part of what we have to do is we have to learn sort of two principles. One of them is that every person has an interesting story. Mm-hmm. Let's learn it. And that every country, every city, every locale has an interesting history and an interesting future, and it's really worth studying.
Yes. It's like that story about Bangladesh. I mean, there's so much to learn from what they did without any flash or fanfare.
Yeah, clearly. I'll give you the thing that brought this to life for me. It's an odd example.
Yeah.
So I had been traveling to Russia many, 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 many times. And I was there on the day. They have this day where actually all the children gather around the war veterans who, and they tell them stories about the war. And I was talking to the person who was my hostess at the time and said, so why do you do this? And she said, because it's absolutely critical for people to know that history. And I said, why is that history so important for you? And she said, well, just think about it. Every male associated to my family of that generation died. Every male. Uncle, cousin, nephew, every one of them. And so we essentially wiped out an entire generation, right? Because it was 64 million died, right? And think about what percentage of the male population in Russia that was. And she said, therefore, we can never forget. And it was, and, you know, I know that kind of story all over the world, and I used to teach it. And I was struck by that one in particular. And I said, I've been passing through this country for years and never thought of that as a defining attribute of the nation.
And maybe if we know what the defining attribute is, we can understand them better.
Actually, we'll come to respect them and love them more. Because what was striking to me is you say, you know, why do you have Russian poetry? Well, it's obvious why I have Russian poetry, right? And so a whole bunch of things started clicking for me. And I said, God, you know, it's an amazing people. So just think about the people who were in what is now St. Petersburg, right?
Yes.
And what they went through.
During the siege.
Yeah, and you say, unbelievable, right? And so there comes this point, which is if the soul of the nation can do that, these have to be pretty cool people, right? So why do I hate them, you know? And so what happens is the more you go visit a place and understand from whence it comes and get to understand its soul, the more you come to appreciate how really interesting it is. And actually, they're just people you want to know and like and love rather than...
And they're very similar to us, actually, right?
Exactly.
They're grieving, basically.
But they also have some pretty interesting differences in their historical background that I can learn from, right? So, you know, you can never be someone else. But one of your first questions, you can sure empathize.
Yes.
And the more you empathize...
It's almost as if, you know, great business comes back to having empathy at the center.
Yeah, I mean, we got to be smart about one point, which is great business also requires you to be a good business person, right? So there's some simple things about
it's the yin and the yang.
Making sure you're efficient and you can operationalize and make things happen. But it's absolutely right, particularly in a world of the kind of presses that we're experiencing today. The ability to understand another on their terms is profoundly important. And I think the other one is the ability to be self-reflective, because it turns out if you are empathic, but you actually don't use that to sort of reflect on yourself in a different way, you don't grow.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point.
You learn, you don't grow. And so it's self-reflective. If you sort of said, you know, what are the, you know, Blair, you described the paradoxes. What are the kind of main effects, really, right? What are the constants? And I think at least two of them are, there's probably three, but one of them is you have to be incredibly empathic and you have to be really self-reflective, and you just have to be a tough-minded business person occasionally.
Blair, thank you so much. That was such a great discussion.
It was fun. Thanks. I loved your questions and I loved the conversation. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope the listeners do too. I
found it fascinating. I'm glad we spoke. I'm glad we met. I think it's going to be a very interesting podcast. So thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, and I look forward to hearing it. And I have to say the range in this conversation was just thrilling. So I'm glad we did it.
Take care. I mean, it's always good to meet a Canadian who likes British bars. I liked you from the first minute, so, you know. Take care, Blair.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye-bye. And that's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed doing the episode. Finally, I want you to remember that the only way to get access to our special offers, the only way to get our special pricing, and the only way to get samples of our content is to join the list on firmsconsulting.com. It's the only way also to get access to our unique advanced content that we make available to insiders. So if you want to get a sneak peek of things, test it out, see what's in there, this is the place to go. And finally, I want to thank you again for making us one of the largest podcast channels around the world for careers and for the 2 million downloads and counting.